can only take the great truths in little doses. Probably why God draws our life out over 70 years or 80 if we are strong. The big truths are simply too much for the psyche at any one moment. It sometimes surprises people that Jesus would be considered in any way subversive, because we've made him so much the founder of our saved religion that we think of him very much as an establishment man. But if you actually are honest about the content of his teaching and the context of his teaching, he's almost undercutting every normal expectation of what religion is supposed to be.
Many people have been misunderstood, but I cannot think of a candidate who has been more misunderstood than Jesus.
I think that everybody who responds to Jesus in one way or another thinks that there's something that makes him captivating, that explains why he's had such a hold on people. And I think that one thing, whatever it is different for almost everybody.
What's happening right now in human history is that perhaps for the first time on a major level, many people seem ready to understand how utterly revolutionary the mind of Jesus was and the teaching of Jesus was.
I am persuaded and convinced that the more we understand his message, what he was trying to get at, it is indeed the case that we just can't imagine virtue, compassion in these proportions.
The reason I like to speak of the Jesus movement is that is always the freshest and most alive stage of a spiritual process. Everything begins with a single individual having a vision, taking a risk, calling us out of our comfort zones. I think Jesus operates in history almost as a divine lure, pulling our humanity out of ourselves, pulling us forward, attracting us, seducing us, if you will, into an ever more attractive humanity.
It was a period of great tension. It was a period of flux, a period of political transition. Palestine was divvied up into about 4 different parts. All of these regions are ancestral regions of Israel, but they're under different authorities, and the relations between these authorities is problematic. The relations of all these authorities with the people, problematic. Then, on top of all of this, there's Roman imperialism. The Romans are running the show. We get some big cities, a lot of wealth being concentrated in the urban areas. Whenever that happens, what's really happening is that stuff is being drained from the countryside. Pressure's being exerted on those agrarian populations to produce more and more surplus, paying more and more taxes, to pay for theaters that they don't attend, for games and amusements that they can't afford, palaces that they don't live in. And that's tension, and that causes a lot of tension.
Therefore, they desperately longed for an improvement in their situation, which they realized, since they were a minuscule group with no power, could not come through their own devices, would have to come through divine intervention. But they had a part to play, and that part was to listen to what Yahweh God had told them, namely, ye shall be a holy people. And they had set up standards as to what that holiness involved.
The Jewish people, like most religions, were controlled by what we call debt codes and purity codes. Sort of loyalty tests, requirements, whereby you could jump hoops and prove whether you were pure.
There was a lot of complaint among various groups about the temple cult, about the priestly establishment, that they no longer represented the interest of the people, that they no longer represented God's interests, and that they were enriching themselves at the people's expense.
By the time Jesus comes, we know that 90% of the economy of the city of Jerusalem had to do with the buying and selling of animals, the penning of animals, the butchering of animals by priests, and the hauling of the animals out by the tens of thousands after every feast day.
So you got this priestly establishment that, according to Mosaic law, they got their cut off the top, right? That the 10% of everything you got. Then on top of that, there's what we would call secular authority. And then on top of that, there's imperial authority. None of those tiers of government are interested in doing anything but taking things from people. There were many people in Israel that were looking for a way out. They were looking for God to do something. And then Jesus comes. We don't know a lot about Jesus in biographical terms. If you wanted to write a biography of Jesus, you'd want to know something about his upbringing, where he grew up, where he went to school, what he studied, how he got his journeyman's license to be a prophet. We know nothing about that.
He wrote nothing, a word or two in the sand, which isn't even recorded. There are no physical descriptions of his appearance.
We don't know his degree of education, but he is not a priest, he's not a Levite, he's not a part of the establishment religious class. He does not do most of his teaching inside synagogue or temple.
We know a little about his public career, which maybe lasted about 3 years, give or take. And it's that 3-year slice of his life that has had the extraordinary impact on Western civilization and, just by extension, all of history. It's pretty remarkable. It suggests that the quality of what he did and the effect that it had on people was really what was so memorable.
We speak of people as charismatic. There are certain people who, just when they step in the room, why, new electricity goes on and people turn to them. Great artists, great politicians have some of that quality, but those are only the foothills, the approximation. But in the case of Jesus, you put a jack under charisma and you just keep on going.
I think the reason Jesus was so attractive to people is because he was such a whole and attractive human being. Now, if we look at the images of Jesus, the pictures even of Jesus in human history from different cultures, we see that we were trying to present him, of course, very much as a spiritual teacher. One of the reasons I think I became a Franciscan, a follower of St. Francis, is because what Francis loved was the humanity of Jesus. And that always attracts people. True human beings attract human beings. You can't resist them. You want to be around them because there's something so rich and real about them that you want them to rub off on you.
He would see a fisherman and say, "Come on, you've got something more in you than catching fish." And they drop everything and just cut their ties and go with him. And it carries over into the masses. Crowds so great that he can't press through them, and they will stay 3 days and 3 nights.
I think the reason people follow Jesus so desperately is he exemplified a humanity that was rich and deep and seductive. He doesn't go around calling himself God, but we quickly pedestalized him, put him up as a God figure, and lost what was the primary lure or attraction, which was that he was the quintessential human being.
The personal engagement of Jesus with people in some way or another was a very important part of his ministry. He did socialize with people, and we have tradition that tries to come to terms with this. People knew that Jesus partied with people, and even today, to say it in those terms, some may find objectionable. I don't mean any disrespect, but if we talk about somebody who went to a place where people gathered together, there was a great deal of conviviality. Maybe there were some, maybe even there were some alcoholic beverages consumed. People were having a good time. Most people call that a party.
That's one of Jesus' most common images, is a wedding feast or a party or a banquet. And no one wants to come because everybody's there. Here comes everybody, and we don't want everybody.
There's a question. Why do you hang out with these people? Why do you party with these people? Why do you do that? Why do we always see you hanging out with these undesirables? I mean, why are you, I don't know, why are you always at the bar? That kind of thing. And the response is, well, the doctor doesn't go to the people who are well, he goes to the people who are sick. That's one way of responding. And then there's another way of responding to it. And this is in contrast to John the Baptist. There's a question. He said, look, somebody comes to Jesus and says, well, we see John's disciples. They fast, they pray, you're just out here hanging out all the time. What's wrong with you? He says, you guys, you lie. If I lie on one side, I'm cursed. If I lie on the other side, I'm cursed. So when John the Baptist came, he didn't drink anything. He was a teetotaler. He was a straight up kind of guy. He was ascetic, and you said that he had some kind of mental problem. I come eating and drinking, doing what he didn't do. And now you have a problem with me. What do you want? So the question was important. And the question was, how come this guy did so much hanging out?
It is a very remarkable fact. The presence of women in Jesus' life, even though he was not married. And I think that one of the virtues of the feminist movement in our time is to point that out, even to Jesus scholars. Well, of course, they read the words all the time, but they never lifted it out.
Women were involved, and the traditions are very clear about it. Certain social habits that Jesus had were embarrassing, I think, to later people, to later Christians. Socializing with socially undesirable people. The Gospel of Luke is very clear. At one point, it says that Jesus was traveling with these women and that they were supporting him. So there's a very strong memory of women being involved in the movement, as it were, and bankrolling it to some extent. I think everybody knows this. Maybe not everybody is all choked up about it, but everybody knows it.
Probably the most striking example of that is this figure, Mary Magdalene. Now, I know we Christians all assume that she was a prostitute. It really never says that. Of course, there are different Marys mentioned, but it mentions a woman who had 7 demons. We just assume, of course, the demon was lust. Never says that at all. But the interesting thing about this woman, Mary Magdalene, is that she is the first one that Jesus appears to after the resurrection, which clearly means she had some significant meaning in his life. She believes, and she becomes the messenger to the messengers. She has to convince the 12 apostles that Jesus has risen. And we now have evidence in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, she was recognized as an apostle, even the first of the apostles, because she believed in the resurrection, first of all, before they did.
That gives us a new bead, a new light on who Jesus was, and it has enormous implications in terms of our efforts, which we're now at least trying to make, to release women from the subordinate position that they have had throughout history.
There's a fit there. There's a very, very tight and compelling fit there that brought women in, that brought other people in. And they came in, they found a place, and they stayed.
Nature is our clearest aperture to the divine. That is what we find just interlacing Jesus' words.
Jesus had a reputation for responding to people verbally in several ways. One was to use a metaphor or an image from lived reality, from the kitchen, from housework, from farm work, from fishing. That's because what people knew, and he could relate to that. He related to it because he was one of them.
He doesn't talk with academic clerical vocabulary. He talks with the vocabulary of the underclass, if you will, the vocabulary of housewives and working men, and uses the images of things that they would understand and see every day.
Jesus draws an analogy between the goodness of God and the indiscriminate bounty of nature. That the sun shines on the just and the unjust. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. In his teaching about anxiety, he says, don't worry about anything, because God will take care of you. And he says, well, look at the lilies of the field. Look at the beautiful colors and how they're so beautifully arrayed. And he talks about Solomon, King Solomon, his resplendent kingdom. He said, Solomon never had a wardrobe like these. You don't have to worry about what you're going to eat. You see these birds that are flying around here. Who feeds them? God feeds them. So, the odds are very good he's going to take care of you too.
The concept of religion as something separate from the flowers of the field and the relationships between family members doesn't exist. There's only life, and good life is religion. Good life is meeting God. It's all one.
He doesn't invest those things with a transcendent quality. He helps us to see the transcendence in those things. So in those moments when we have difficulty believing in the goodness of God and life being as it is, there are many, we can see that goodness.
I'll just give you one example. Once I was at a conference. It was on the Pacific coast. The dining room looked out over the ocean. And as we were eating, the sun began to set. as it disappeared more and more over the horizon, why the conversation stopped. People were just glued to that. And when the final little sliver vanished, a 3-year-old kid started to applaud, and the whole dining room picked up. I mean, God, you've done it again.
The desert is a place where people don't congregate. It's no man's land. And there's a lot of that in Palestine. There's a tradition in Israel of prophets coming from the desert or going to the desert, or people coming from or going to the desert. We know that Moses had his encounter with God in the desert, that Israel received the commandments of God in the desert, that they wandered in the wilderness. John the Baptizer comes out of such a space, and he's the person who is functionally the advance man for Jesus. In his mode of dress, his diet, the locusts and wild honey, the camel's hair coat, all of this stuff signifies that he is a marginal figure. When we move closer to the divine, we find ourselves in those marginal areas, right? Sort of out on the periphery of things.
Jesus' journey into the desert would be his, what I would call in my language, his classic initiation rite. Leaving the world of business as usual. Leaving ordinary structures of role, identity, comfort, security, the usual self-image that you dress yourself up with, means nothing out there.
It's a liminal place. And in any liminal place, good things happen and not so good things happen. But whatever happens, it's important, it's big.
Liminal space. Limina in Latin means the threshold, where you've left one room, but you haven't entered the next room yet. You're in between. Now that is the unique space in which all transformation happens.
As the Tao Te Ching puts it, muddy water let stand will clear. The mud will go to the bottom, and we can live in a clear ambient. But we are so harassed by the impingement, no, that's too weak, the avalanche of distractions and demands and duties, many of which we impose on ourselves, that there's no time to know thyself.
We're letting everything mirror us moment by moment by moment. If you never break that addiction to the hall of mirrors, the revolving hall of mirrors of identity and role and persona and prestige and possessions, after 30 years, you basically don't have a clue. You really don't. You don't have a clue who you are. That's why all spiritual disciplines are about some form of understimulation, some form of letting go. All great spirituality is about letting go.
What one ultimately lets go of is the ego, this clamorous ego with its demands. Aldous Huxley once said that the supreme test of life is to overcome the fundamental human disability of egoism, putting ourselves above everybody else.
That's why all the great spiritual teachers are always sending you into solitude, into the desert, into the belly of the whale like Jonah, into the place of darkness where you can't fix it, where you can't control it, where you can't even understand it, and then God spits you up on a new shore. the prophet spit up on the new shore, knowing something forever that he didn't know and would not know had he not been eaten by the whale. I think Jesus is saying that there's something you know when you've gone through that. Something wonderful always happens because finally you can't sustain yourself anymore and you have to find out what it is that really sustains you. You meet somebody. I think that's what happened to Jesus. If you remember, the only message he comes out of the desert with is, I'm a beloved son. It's a safe universe. We know now from cultural historical study that up to the time of Abraham, human sacrifice was found on every continent, if you go back far enough. That human beings felt God was basically dangerous, toxic, someone to be afraid of. And for some strange reason, the human mind felt if we would kill our best and our brightest, that this might placate this angry God. That's why every theophany in the whole Bible, every time God breaks in, the first word of the angel or the apparition is always, do not be afraid. Every time. You know why? Because in all of human history, when God entered history, you had to be afraid. God always wanted blood. And this becomes a great turnaround in Jesus. It's always, don't be afraid.
In Jesus, God was making an appeal to assure people who had real doubts about the love and care of God and had really good reasons to doubt the love and care of God and how worthy they might be or deserving they might be of that love and care, that was not a problem, that was not the issue, that God's love and care was very real.
And of course, it's not that God was ever violent, it's that we were. We largely made God into what we wanted God to be. And because we were a violent people, a hateful people, an aggressive people, we basically made God into the same. As some have said, God created us in God's image and we returned the compliment. I think it's crucial to understand Jesus, that we know he's not primarily, and this is going to shock some people, he's not primarily talking about a system of requirements, a behavioral set of patterns that will make God like you. It's not a religion of requirements, it's a religion of relationship. Relationship is everything, right relationship. It's how to be present, how to be vulnerable, how to let other people change you.
Jesus placed the emphasis on the religion of the heart, which involved, above all else, love of neighbor and trying to treat the neighbor, in his words, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who mourn, which is a shorthand way of saying feel their feelings as if they were your own.
He's saying, follow me and do what I'm doing. Come and live the way I'm living. A simple life in this world, a shared life in this world, a nonviolent life, a compassionate life.
He was summoning others to join him, that people would become involved, that they would enter in, and in the process of this involvement, become transformed. People who don't accept things the way they are and have an alternative vision always constitute the danger for the status quo. Jesus was an organizer. He affected people. He changed people's lives. People did other things and thought in other ways because of what he did and said. And I'm convinced this is what got Jesus into trouble. When you've got a bunch of people who are basically running the show, they are responsible for the historical project of the moment. You can only have one of those to a moment. If you have more than one, then the two, or however many you have, are going to be in conflict with each other. Jesus' outburst in the temple is one of those pieces of tradition that apparently everyone knew. Jesus violently rearranged his furniture in the temple and says various uncomplimentary things about what's going on there.
The religious powers, the Pharisees, scribes, and so on, they were the religious leaders of the time, and this was a direct affront to their authority. And so he was like an upstart. Well, you can see how that led to friction on the spot, right at the moment.
And so it is a prelude then to Jesus' arrest. And so this is the engine that drove the temple establishment to finally come against him. There's been a big debate historically about whether Jesus was a revolutionary or not. Was he really revolutionary? Did he really constitute a threat to the Roman state? Or wasn't he just a preacher of righteousness? And did he have a political program? If so, was it an insurgent one? Wasn't it a big mistake? Maybe he was executed for it. I don't think it was a mistake. I think the Romans knew exactly what they were doing. They discerned the presence of a troublemaker who was sending some kind of social shockwave across his neighborhood. The Romans didn't care why. They didn't care what kind of God he worshipped. They didn't care what kind of traditions he was trying to reactivate. All they knew is he was talking about a kingdom that wasn't theirs. And you only get one kingdom to a customer. So he had to go.
The cross was the most brutal, agonizing form of death in Jesus' time.
We don't know who invented this form of torture. But even if the Romans didn't invent it, once they got it, they refined it. It was just one specimen of their technical expertise. They were good at things like that. You know, building roads, organizing armies, executing people. It was the most horrible death you could die in antiquity. It was horrible not only because it was painful, it was excruciatingly painful, but because it was public. It was an act of degradation. This was not just a way of executing a criminal. This was a way of terrorizing a population. Such people were public spectacles. They were afforded no grace or mercy, executed naked, usually, then just left to die in the sun. This was the death that Jesus suffered because of the sentence that was declared. He was convicted as a criminal for acts against the Roman state.
Whenever you try to build a bridge between two sides, I always say they'll walk on you from both sides. You'll be misunderstood by both sides. You're not in either group. That's the naked position of Jesus. Jesus was killed on the collision of opposites. He was crucified on the coincidence of opposites, that he hangs there wherever oppositional energy comes together, of this group and that group. It's no accident, even in the image of his crucifixion, that he hangs between heaven and earth, between a good thief and a bad thief, divine and human, holding together the ultimate opposites that name our soul. And he gives his life to reconcile the two sides.
So, the body's broken, he's humiliated to death. When it happened, it was such a disastrous finish to what was such a glorious beginning that no hope, no human hope could sustain it. And so everyone's heart was broken. 3 days later, there are rumors that he's alive. Now, the traditions are very emphatic about two things: that he died. He didn't swoon, it wasn't a coma, he was dead. He was dead. The body was taken away, and then when people were searching for the body, it was gone. What happened to the body? Well, the followers say that he got up and walked away from it. Well, how do you know that? I said, well, because we saw him. He said at one point, maybe about 500 people saw him. So a lot of people in the community saw Jesus after his execution. The crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus is so important for Christian faith because it means that there is a Good Friday that's really not that good at all, where hope just can't be found. It's not that you can't see it, it's not there. It's really not there. But your incapacity to hope doesn't stop the hope. God will make things happen for us that sometimes we can't even believe would happen. God will do the unbelievable. In the resurrection of Jesus, and even in his ministry, people could see a person who was realizing in some way in his actions the aspirations of a people. He's brutally executed, but even that doesn't stop him. And so he himself then becomes the greatest sign that God is at work, that God will do the impossible.
Isn't that what you'd expect of God? That God would be too much? That God would be always greater than our mind could imagine it. In fact, as many of the mystics said, if your mind can imagine it, you know it's not God. If you've got it explained or figured out, then that cannot be God. It's got to be greater than that, bigger than that, more than that. Suddenly, it's a safe universe, right? It's okay, and it's okay at the core. The Jesus mystery starts with this one man getting it right. And I think if we had read Jesus as, here's what it means to be human, instead of, here's the way to get to heaven, we would have had a much less contentious Christianity, a much less ideological, heady Christianity, arguing about who's right and who's going to heaven and who's got the right answers to the divine SAT test. You know, I mean, it's basically a waste of time.
One of the things that constantly revives the tradition is a return to Jesus, and I think that's why we have such interest in Jesus. In a way, among other things, he's a touchstone for the authenticity of the tradition. And his words carry an inherent critique of the tradition itself. His words constantly keep the tradition honest.
He never needs to present an image of himself as right or perfect. It's just, this is what I know. This is what I have to stand for, because this is what I've experienced. Most human beings are not academics. They're not educated. All most of us have is our own experience. And so this is a great liberation that we finally have a God figure who says that we can trust our own experience. I'm convinced that that's really what it means to carry the cross, to carry the burden of your own experience, even if it might be wrong. That's the cross, because you're never sure that you're right. And yet I know that I am who I am, who I am, and this is what I've gone through, and I've got to carry this, the mystery of who I am. I think he is saying I'm willing to bear the burden of my own reality, wherever it leads me. Never sure that it's right. That's why it's called faith, and why faith is so rare, and why Jesus said, when the Son of Man returns, will he find any faith on earth? I think Jesus really had doubts. Religion is common. It's on every street corner. Faith is very rare. Jesus came to teach faith.